Today we have four eminent speakers with us for the deliberation. Eminent speaker Ms. Andum Indra, Judge Supreme Court, Dr. Abhishek MP, former Chairman Parliamentary Law, former ASG India, Mr. Harsh Neotia, past Chairman CIA Eastern Region and Chairman Ambuja Neotia Group, and we also have Ms. Sucharita Basu, partner Aquilaw. So before handing over the mic to Mr. Neotia, I would like to request all the participants to put their mic in during the session. During the answer session, I request participants to float their question in the chat box only. During the question answer session, I request all to float their question in the the Neotia for note, please.
You're
Hello, we can hear
audible.
you.
Yes, sir. You're audible.
First of all, sincere apologies to everyone for this delay in getting connected online for some strange reason. This technology was not helping out. But I'm really delighted to welcome in our midst today Honorable Justice Indu Malhotra ji, Judge of the Supreme Court of India, Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, eminent jurist and third term MP, Ms. Sucharita Basu, partner Aquilaw, and other distinguished friends and officials of the CII. A very good afternoon to all of you. As you all know, we are, of course, in the midst of this unprecedented crisis of COVID-19. And I will not dwell much on the medical and health related issues, but as we are all aware, this pandemic has also huge implications on the economy and livelihoods of people. So I would like to focus today to say that the business, as we can all see, is hugely disrupted. Lots of industries, lots of businesses are virtually shut ever since the lockdown. Some amount of work is happening in certain sectors, but there are many, many sectors such as hospitality and tourism, real estate, and many others, construction, which have been almost brought to a grinding halt. All of this means that it is going to take us quite a while to get back to normal, even though some opening up has started in the green zones and some very limited work in the orange zones. It is going to be, I think, at least more than a month to let other things gradually open up, which, which means that we are going to continuously face the challenges as far as the economy is concerned. We are also aware of the issue related to migrant workers. They have somehow slowly getting to their homes, and it might be quite a challenge getting them back to the work, at least for a few months. So all this means that the economy will be severely in support would be available. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to get the economy back on track. Of course, all of and more we would like to discuss with the eminent panel that is here today. We are also aware that particularly small and medium companies will find it difficult to keep sustaining payment of wages and also to carry on with their limited resources to find the working capital. The pickup in the economy will also be slow. People still have fear of going out and living their normal lives, so consumption would be greatly impacted. Businesses being put under stress and job losses looming large, I think the normal human consumption of non-essentials will be greatly slowed down. So all this will result in many situations. There are many illegal questions that arise in this, and I would be really happy to see how we can get some guidance from the eminent panel that we have. With these few words, I would like to once again welcome everyone and hand over to Ms. Sucharita Basu, partner Equilaw, to moderate this discussion.
More than 700-800 participants, and you know how technology sometimes works. But I think I will start because we've made the speakers wait for a very long time. So namaskar and good afternoon. I'm Sucharita Basu and I have the privilege of being the session discussant. At the outset, many thanks to CII and of course to Shri Harsh Nivetia. Our gratitude to the esteemed speakers for being a part of this session, and we are thankful to the participants as well, who have joined us from all over the country and overseas and across sectors. So it is indeed an offer which cannot be refused to hear the two stalwarts we have as speakers today, and I have been personally complimented by several people for being able to organize this extremely relevant webinar, which albeit has been the teamwork of all my colleagues at Equilaw. Now I shall very summarily actually now introduce the session content and set the context. So, and I'll take it forward from where Mr. Nivetia left, is that in April 2020, the International Monetary Fund, they further slashed India's growth estimate for FY21 to 1.9% from an already decreased 5.8% estimated in January 2020, with the warning that this is the worst recession since the Great Depression, and which will perhaps dwarf the economic damage caused by the global financial crisis a decade back. Now, thus we are certainly in very uncertain times, which is unforeseen, which is unprecedented and beyond the control of those very humans who have achieved so much, including going to the moon and back. But today what we are doing is helplessly seeing ailments, deaths, sufferings, poverty, lockdown, closures, joblessness, bankruptcies, and all of this cascading and having an impact in the downfall of the economy. Now here I would like to borrow from a gentleman named Cass Roberts Hunstein, who's an American legal scholar, and who stated that the field of law and economics, it has revolutionized legal thinking. It may well count as one of the most influential intellectual development of law in the last 100 years. It has also had a major impact on how regulators in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, they deal with antitrust, environmental protection, highway safety, healthcare, nuclear power, and workers' rights. So taking a cue from this, it cannot be stressed enough that legal solutions for the improvement of the economy, it is imperative, especially at this juncture, where almost all, ranging from SMEs, MSMEs, to large conglomerates who are battling with legal issues, emerging from delayed or non-performance of commercial contracts caused by the unforeseen pandemic and its manifestation as a force majeure event, loan and interest payment struggles, labor and employment worries, antitrust issues, data privacy and intellectual property concerns, and taxation matters, just to name a few, and numerous sub-granular subsets of all of this and more. So tackling of the situation now and post-COVID-19 therefore does require legal intervention, and a lot of it, and a seamless collaboration between economics and law is perhaps the call of the hour. Which is why we thought this webinar is going to be extremely relevant. Naturally, the governments are also releasing orders, notifications, advisories, guidelines, amendments, etc., in order to somehow tackle the commercial concerns, in addition to the more grievous challenge of protecting the health of the population. A continuous debate is on as to whether the steps which have been taken are optimal, on the efficacy and the equity thereof. Already some of them have been challenged before the courts. Moreover, now our attention is also moving towards reopening the economy while containing the virus. Now this conundrum, it is being faced by other nations as well. So I was reading a McKinsey article a couple of days back, and it says that in the past 6 weeks, India's economy, it has functioned at about a 49 to 57% of its full activity level by their estimates. Now also the economic cost, which is certainly unavoidable now at this early stages of lockdown, it may not be sustainable in the long term. It is becoming increasingly clear for us that COVID-19 will also not disappear immediately, and the economy needs to be managed alongside persistent infection risks, possibly for a further prolonged period. In fact, after reopening, many countries have needed to resume lockdown in response to the rising infection rates, and India may not be an exception. So what we are looking at is a lot of disputes, many more disputes from the dire business conditions which the pandemic has caused. A big question also now is the way these disputes will be handled and in the future of by the legal system of our country. Now, will COVID-19 also change the methodology of court proceedings? Will alternative dispute resolutions become more popular? If yes, then how can such dispute resolution mechanisms be made more structured, time-bound, technology-driven, and cost-efficient? How are other jurisdictions of the world, such as China, Singapore, UK, EU, Australia, coping up with this avalanche of legal problems which have arisen in the wake of COVID-19? Now, our discussions with our eminent speakers will be on and around some of this. I hope I was audible all through.
Clear and loud. Yeah, it is.
Okay, fine. Very well. So our first speaker, and I'm really, my apologies for making her wait for so long, is Honorable Ms. Justice Indu Malhotra. Honorable Ms. Justice Indu Malhotra is an embodiment of legal acumen and has made an indelible impression in the field of arbitration through her resolute endeavor as a legal practitioner, an arbitrator in domestic and international arbitrations, and as an author. Before her appointment as a judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Malhotra had an illustrious career spanning over 3 decades, beginning in 1983. She was the second woman lawyer to be designated as a senior advocate by the Supreme Court and is the first woman to have been directly elevated from the bar to the Supreme Court. Now, we as a nation and also as a global community, we are faced with a catastrophe which has brought a paradigm shift in the conventional business working methods, functioning of our daily lives, and access to justice. And it is our honor and privilege to have Honorable Ms. Justice Indu Malhotra with us today on this session. And we look forward to hear from her as to how we progress and how we transition into a robust legal system, society, business, and economy as a whole, which can bear such shocks in future. Justice Malhotra, over to you, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sucharita. Now, COVID-19 has had a devastating effect on the economies of almost 212 countries, which have been impacted by this deadly virus. Some of the countries like India have imposed nationwide lockdowns, which has had a positive effect, that is of containing the contagion and reducing the number of fatalities. And the adverse effect is that it has disrupted supply chains across the world. Consumer spending has taken a huge hit due to restrictions and a heightened insecurity and inclination for hoarding. India being the second largest population in the world, which is approximately 1.6 billion, the problems assume gigantic proportions. I am going to broadly touch upon the legal aspects of the law as it stands today and the various notifications which have been brought about by the government. So I'll broadly take you through that. The nationwide lockdown, which was announced on the 24th of March 2020, it led to the complete stoppage of business in India. And as Sarita said a minute ago, the IMF rating of India has fallen abysmally low to 1.9% from what was estimated earlier at 5.8% of the GDP growth rate. The World Bank has similarly downgraded it between 1.5% and 2.8%, which is the lowest since the 1991 economic reforms. The various sectors of the economy some of the sectors which have been badly hit are, of course, aviation, hospitality, real estate and infrastructure projects, which are primarily labor intensive, and there has been a disruption of raw material. Automobile industry, which was dependent on spare parts, etc., coming from Wuhan in China has been badly affected, amongst others. Now, given this background, and especially the fact that India's daily wage earners have been the first hit segment of the population, out of a total workforce of about 471.5 million, there are only 12.3% regular workers receiving some form of social security. The others had moved from their rural bases to the urban areas to make a living, a precarious living, which was really hand to mouth, and they were dependent on daily wages. With their return to the rural areas, there has been a huge setback to industrial growth. Now, the first step which was taken was by the RBI, which issued a notification on 27th March 2020. It was a directive issued to all banks, NBFCs, all India financial institutions, directing them to grant a moratorium of 3 months for the period commencing from 1st of March till 31st of May. During the period of moratorium, the interest would continue to tick, and that was a part of the directive. But at this moment, I do want to pause for a moment. A petition was filed by a home buyer who said that there should be a waiver of interest. And this issue is now pending in the Supreme Court. Notice was issued yesterday by the court to both the RBI and the Government of India, on which instructions will be taken, and if the matter will be posted for further after 2 weeks. Even with respect to the moratorium, there was a petition filed before the Supreme Court, wherein a grievance was made that it was not being followed, and the Supreme Court passed a direction that the directive of the RBI has to be followed in letter and spirit. These two orders, along with the RBI directive, has provided a moratorium on repayment of loans and reschedulement for the time being for a period of 3 months. Now, insofar as the legislation is concerned, there are two basic acts which are on the statute book as of today. One is the Epidemics Diseases Act of 1897, which was a hurriedly framed legislation because at that time a bubonic plague had spread through the city of Bombay, and the British government had framed this legislation to meet this emergent situation. Even though that act is not equipped to meet the challenges which have been thrown up by the present pandemic, it continues to remain on the statute book. There was a move in 2017 to repeal this act and replace it with an act called the Public Health Prevention, Control and Management of Epidemics, Bioterrorism and Disasters Bill in 2017. But the bill remained in draft form. It was not even tabled before Parliament, for the reason that it was realized that the two main subjects, which is public health and hospitals, are in list 2, that is the state list, and Parliament could not have enacted legislation on this aspect except under Article 252 if 2 or more states had given their consent and the others had adopted it, which has not happened. So the Epidemics Act of 1897 continues to remain on the statute book, and it was invoked by an ordinance being passed, which was basically to protect the medicos from the onslaught of violence by persons who were being provided treatment. Apart from that, there is no other relevance with respect to this act. The second enactment, which is in force, is the under this enactment that the nationwide lockdown has been exercised. It's an exercise of the powers under this act that the lockdown was announced for the country. This act defines disaster and disaster management in very wide terms. And I will take a minute to just read the definition of disaster because it's very wide and it covers almost every eventuality. Disaster has been defined by Section 2D under the Disaster Management Act to mean a catastrophe, mishap, calamity, or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made causes or by accident or negligence which results in substantial loss of life or human suffering or damage to and destruction of property or damage to or degradation of the environment and is of such nature or magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. This Act provides a three-tier management level. One is at the center, the states, and at the local level. It has various provisions. Section 13 provides for relief in loan repayments. Section 35 provides for measures by the government, various measures which can be taken by the government for disaster management. Section 71 bars the jurisdiction of all courts except the High Court and the Supreme Court. And 72 gives it an overriding effect. It's under this that various notifications have been issued by the ministries, by various ministries to give effect to measures to alleviate the problems which have arisen in the wake of COVID-19. The first one, the first one was the 2020, February 19th, 2020, the Finance Ministry issued a notification defining a force majeure clause and particularly the COVID-19 being a force majeure provision. Several other notifications have been issued by the Ministry of Shipping, Ministry of Labour. All of these notifications are being issued under this Umbrella Act. The implementation of this Act is being done by the National Executive Committee. And the first pan-India disaster, that's COVID-19, has led to the invocation of this Act for the first time. There have also been amendments which have been effected to the Companies Act, which have been issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which provide for board meetings to be held through audio-visual means for transacting business. There have been also an amendment to the rules with respect to the holding of board meetings and certain provisions granting extension of time for holding AGMs, etc. The IBC has also been amended, and those provisions are of importance, particularly the monetary threshold for initiating corporate insolvency resolution process. It has been enhanced from 1 lakh to 1 crore, and it is to protect the small, the micro, and the medium enterprises from proceedings being initiated against them under this provision. The Finance Minister has also made a statement on 24th of March saying that they are closely watching the situation, and if it becomes necessary, they may put Section 7, which is initiation of the CIRP by a financial creditor, Section 9, which is initiation by an operational creditor, and Section 10, which is initiation by the corporate applicant themselves, in abeyance if the need arises. But that is still in a process of contemplation. The NCLAT has passed an order on 30th March that the period of lockdown, which was ordered by the central government and state government, shall be excluded from the period of the resolution process under Section 12 of the IBC. Provision has been made for exclusion of the period of lockdown, even with respect to liquidation proceedings of a corporate debtor, by the insertion of Regulation 47 capital A in the IBBI liquidation process second amendment regulations of 2020. will now go in with I will deal with the aspect of the functioning of the courts. COVID-19 has led to a dramatic change and transformation in the functioning of the courts. There has been a wholesale scaling down of the conventional operations to prevent litigants, lawyers, court officers, and the judges from being affected by this contagious virus. The use of technology has assumed critical importance. A notification was issued by the Supreme Court on 22nd March 2020, wherein it was directed that hearings would be conducted by video conferencing with enhanced use of technology. A beginning has certainly been made, but it is going to take some time to operationalize it. We have started in the Supreme Court. I must confess, there are glitches. We are trying to overcome it. And by the time it becomes operational in the high courts and district courts, it will take more time. A couple of the high courts have been very successful with virtual hearings, but for it to become perfect, it will certainly take time. An elaborate standard operating procedure has been placed on the, has been issued by the court with respect to e-filings, exemption from affirmed affidavits of clients, hearing of urgent matters, mentioning matters, and listing of these cases. But the issues which require further attention are, one is familiarity with technology by court staff, by lawyers, and by judges. E-filings also entail digitalization of documents, which requires attention. Availability of a reliable source of power and internet connectivity is also of crucial importance for these hearings to take place on virtual platforms. There will also be a significant change in the procedure for production of witnesses and recording of evidence, because matters cannot be adjourned indefinitely. God alone knows how long this pandemic is to last, whether humanity will be able to find a vaccine to contain it within 6 months, a year, 2 years. It's difficult to hazard a guess. But in the meanwhile, proceedings cannot be put on hold indefinitely. So this is one of the areas, that is change in the procedure for production of witnesses and recording of evidence, is one of the critical areas which certainly requires more attention. An order was passed on the 15th of March 2020 by the Supreme Court, extending the period of limitation for filing appeals and petitions as specified in the General Law of Limitation or in special statutory enactments. Irrespective of whether it's condonable or not, it would automatically stand extended till further orders. By a further order on 6th of May 2020, Supreme Court has specifically made reference to the limitation periods which have been specified in the Arbitration Act and the Negotiable Instruments Act, and has extended the period of limitation under these special statutes. Now, with respect to arbitrations, which is the alternate mode of dispute resolution, surely COVID-19 has had an impact on it. Arbitrations were conceived to be an alternate mode of dispute resolution, which was conceived to be cost-effective, efficient, and less costly than litigation. But over the years, the expenses of arbitration have enormously grown. It has become a costly affair, flying down arbitrators, parties, litigants, lawyers to have even one hearing. I think a time has come for us to cut down these unnecessary costs and to shrink shrink the expenses with respect to all these unnecessary travels. In my view, the preliminary hearings on jurisdictional issues, on framing issues, and interim awards can be passed virtual hearing and video conferencing. They do not require in-person hearings. Where in-person hearings become necessary are with respect to evidence, examination and cross-examination of witnesses, and the last leg, which is final submissions, I think would require in-person hearings. If procedural hearings in some international arbitrations are being conducted through video conferencing, I think it should become the norm even for domestic arbitrations, and it should be should be applied across the board, whether domestic or international. We need to cut costs because the liquidity crunch is also there in the market. Parties will not be able to afford the huge fees and expenses which all these travel and in-person hearings entailed. Video conferencing in international arbitrations has also raised certain issues. One is the logistics, when parties reside in different parts of the world. The second is availability of an effective internet connectivity. The third is over-speaking and confusion on virtual platforms, possibility of technical glitches, and experience of cross-examination is not the same as in-person hearings. So these issues will have to be dealt with by the efficient use of technology, and probably at least all the other hearings as of now can take place while the evidence and final submissions could be deferred for some time. To overcome these issues, whether in court hearings or in arbitration, the role of IT has become very critical in the administration of virtual hearings. Preparation of hearings in advance will have to be far more effective, and I think the entire shift will be towards better pleadings, better, shorter, more focused pleadings, rather than having these long submissions which becomes difficult to go through without oral assistance. So this shift will take place in both litigation and arbitration if virtual hearings are to take place. Another aspect which is of importance when the pandemic continues to remain rife is the appointment of emergency arbitrators. Even though our Act, the 96 Act, does not make provision for it, but there is no embargo for appointing an emergency arbitrator to obtain interim relief, because emergency arbitrators have always been contacted either on telephonically or through video conferencing to obtain interim relief. And the definition of an arbitral award is an inclusive definition which should include an award passed by an emergency arbitrator. So I think one can avail of one can take the benefit of an emergency arbitrator, and this would, frankly speaking, be far easier in an institutional arbitration than an ad hoc arbitration, because institutions, I think most of the arbitral institutions in India have rules providing for emergency arbitrators being appointed and their awards being enforced under Section 9 of the 1996 Act. These are broadly the issues and the legal framework which has arisen during the pandemic. And with these words, I conclude, and I would thank both CII and Aquilaw for hosting this seminar on a very seminal topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Justice Malhotra. And very, very relevant points has been raised and summarized, because now we have a plethora of these laws and orders, and it's really filling our inboxes and our minds. and causing us more tension than it would ever be. And which is why this webinar, so that we know where we stand as far as legal provisions are concerned. Now, thank you so much. And now we'll perhaps move to our next esteemed speaker, who is Dr. Abhishek Singhvi. Dr. Abhishek Singhvi is a senior 3-term sitting MP. He is a former chairman, Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice. He was India's youngest designated senior advocate at 34 and India's youngest appointed additional Solicitor General at age 37 in 1997. He is a well-known author and columnist and a visible media personality. He is also the senior-most national spokesperson of the Congress Party. His columns have appeared in India's 2 top English dailies and have been published as 2 books titled Candid Corner and Straight Talk, both with forewords written by Dr. Manmohan Singh. He is also an occasional columnist in major Hindi dailies, Dainik Bhaskar and Rajasthan Patrika. Awarded the Global Leader for Tomorrow Awards by World Economic Forum at Davos in 1999, Dr. Singhvi has been the opening lead speaker for the Treasury Congress benches in Parliament for almost every major debate from 2006 to 2013. He has been the common factor in almost all landmark Supreme Court cases spanning constitutional law, corporate law, and arbitration, and several other subjects. He supports many charities, including the Prayas Center for Destitute Children and the Singhvi Scholarship at Trinity College, Cambridge. This is apart from the sterling work done by him for over 12 years in Rajasthan from his MP-led funds, supporting 400 projects in the field of health and education. Dr. Singhvi topped India at the School Leaving India School Certificate Exam and did BA Economic Honours, St. Stephen's College, and MA and PhD from Trinity College, Cambridge, UK. He also taught at St. John's College, Cambridge, and did a brief summer program called PIL from Harvard, USA. So it's really a privilege to have a polymath with us, if I will use that word. And I would now like to have Dr. Singhvi foremost address the elephant in the room, which is the dichotomy of the pandemic being a force majeure or not, contractually or otherwise. Now, the relevance of the content of force majeure clause for its interpretation, invocation, application has become a global discussion now. So can we in absolute terms state that COVID-19 is an act of God, it's a natural calamity and a force majeure, especially in the light of the sheer magnitude of the disaster which has been caused by COVID-19? And also taking into account the view of the judgments of the Supreme Court, such as Energy Watchdog or Bangar, which does not seem to have very widely constructed force majeure conditions. And we would also like to know from him, because we have industry stakeholders amongst us, is to what is the bearing of the force majeure, even if it is now, on several commercial contracts, like payment to employees, and read with the different kind of advisories which have been issued by the government on payment of rentals, rescission of lease, manufacturing, trading contracts, supply chain contracts, in fact, also real estate sector, because RERA is also there now, and also on infrastructure contracts, to name a few. So over to Dr. Singhvi, and we would really like to hear from him now.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me better than I can hear some of the opening speakers. I'm not very fond of seeing myself, but I cannot see myself. So I hope everybody can hear and see me. Otherwise, it would sound like a ghost.
Dr. Singhvi, I can't see you. Is your video off?
No, the video is on, which is why I asked that question. It's been on, but let me again press it. Oh, yes, I've reappeared now. Thank you.
Yes, now I can see you.
Honorable Justice Malhotra, Mr. Harsh Nevatia, Sucharita, the CII office bearers, friends. You know, every crisis, every problem has silver linings. One of the great silver linings of COVID has been the spawning of an enormous, humongous genre of corona jokes. So much so that I an article on corona jokes in a lighter vein in one of my columns. My favorite one to start this rather tepid and rather despairing theme of life amongst corona. But my favorite one is the one where the Psychiatric Association issued a circular for all, especially its patients. And it said that you don't need to call us psychiatrists if it's quite normal to talk to plants and trees during corona because you are homebound and that's quite normal. But if they start talking back to you, that's the time you have to call us. Now, you have asked me to speak, among others, on force majeure and also on some aspects of employees and some aspects of the application of the Disaster Act. And Harsh Revatia has spoken about the economic aspect. And let me start by saying that really we will concentrate on the legal aspect, but it is ultimately a very partial approach because COVID cannot be seen even partially without a look at the economic side. So at the end, if I have time, I will add a few words on the general economic scene, which is ultimately the bedrock of combating COVID. But sticking to the legal aspect first, let me start by, and this is not, I know it's not a legal community and I'm not going to be technical, but some slight amount of law is required here. Let me start by telling you how force majeure or frustration, which are of course technically different words but used interchangeably largely, in law has meant something quite different than this great romanticization of this word after COVID. After COVID, everybody is talking of force majeure and frustration and benefit. The tenant talks about it, the landlord talks about it. Everybody thinks there is some excuse, escape route. But the first part of what I want to open with is that the legal approach is very much stricter. The legal threshold of these words is actually far higher. So as the law stands today, I'm sorry to disappoint a lot of your stakeholders, whether they are on the winning side, the benefit side, or the non-benefit side. But on the strict threshold of law as it stands today, I am afraid they have to be disappointed. Many of the examples during COVID would not qualify as force majeure under the standard definitions. Although, before I start on that explanation, let me say that COVID itself will lead to lawyers and judges redefining this concept in law. What stands today, but first what stands today. Now remember, I'm going to do a fan dancer's job, draw attention to the subject without really covering it, because frustration and FM is really 500 years of English law and about 70 years of Indian law, a very heavily trodden path. So to cull out a few principles is really a fan dancer's job. But broadly, and those of who are very industrious or interested should read 4 out of like 1,000 cases. 4 are very useful in our Indian context. The most seminal is the Bangar case of 1954, authored by a great judge, Justice B.K. Mukherjee. And in between, there are the Alopi case of the 60s and the Nehati case of the late 60s, 1968. And then you bring up to speed with the recent judgment of Justice Nariman in 2017, as you just mentioned, Energy Watchdog. Now, in a nutshell, what are the principles culled out from this 500 years of jurisprudence in England and the 70 years in India? One, that though the Latin phrase from which it comes, vis major, originated from physical issues, earthquakes, tempests, typhoons, force majeure has been acknowledged to be a wider term, much wider than the narrower Latin phrase vis major, from where it draws its sustenance. Second, that though we have a plethora of English law, we have to ultimately be bound by 2 of our main sections of the statute, which I'll not bore you with, but they are the guiding sheet anchor, section 32 and section 56 of the Contract Act. And ultimately, we have enough law that English law remains only of persuasive interest. Thirdly, the juristic dilemma with which the judges were struck when they started with this concept, way back 500 years ago and today, was that one juristic philosophical theory under force majeure, underlying force majeure, was that it is like an implied term which the parties found so obvious as not to include it. So they said, hypothetically, that A and B are entering into a contract. if this happens, it's obvious that this will happen. So let's not state it. It's so obvious. That's the implied clause theory of frustration. And then there is the Denning approach. Well, frustration has occurred. It's unforeseen. Let me as a judge do justice. You know, Lord Denning was a great person. He took the bull by the horns and did justice as he felt justice ought to be done. Law, I won't say law be damned, but law take a second or third place. So that's the pure objective theory, which the judge decides in the context of a new supervening circumstance, what is best for the party. In between is the third theory underlying frustration and force majeure, which is that if this happened, which is unforeseen by the parties, what would a reasonable man, law's mythical reasonable man, without the reasonable man, I don't know where law would be. I don't even know whether such a person exists. But what a reasonable man would do. Now, my own view is, and that's I think where the law stands, obviously the first of the theories is farcical because the people never really thought of it. Otherwise, they would have written it clearly. So to suggest that it was so obvious that the people felt that we should not even state it is a false theory. The third theory, the second one, the Lord Denning approach, is wrong, not farcical, but wrong because it rewrites the contract for the parties. It makes it the judge's, chancellor's foot. It makes it the pure subjective discretion of a judge and varies from judge to judge. So possibly the middle juristic theory of the reasonable man is the right approach. And by and large, although not with such clarity, courts have inclined to that, and I think that's the better approach. Now, why is the threshold very high? Which is why I wanted to hate to disappoint, but would disappoint your stakeholders on the law as it stands. The approach to frustration and force majeure is that the party pleading it or relying upon it or invoking it as an excusing circumstance must cross a very high threshold and a burden of proof. The words used are very strong. So the fundamental principle is that the frustration must virtually create a new contract. The judges use the word that there must be a break in connection and identity with the original contract. Most of these are my paraphrasing of judicial words, which is why this shows the high threshold. They say that it must upset the very foundation on which the parties proceeded. So they proceeded to make a contract for A, and the new circumstances have virtually made a new contract for B. Only then you can claim an excuse and a justification. They also use the phrase that the circumstances which are alleged to have changed must altogether destroy the basis of the adventure or the bargain with which the parties started. Now comes the more pessimistic part. They say that price changes are actually, contrary to popular misconception, the least of the justifiable circumstances. Onerousness simpliciter or increased burden is a relatively lesser circumstance in permitting force majeure. Again, contrary to popular belief, where people believe that this has become much more onerous, I should be excused. That's not the law of frustration. Availability of alternatives has been used to a remarkable extent to reject frustration. I mean, Justice Nariman in Energy Watchdog in 2017 cites a House of Lords judgment, a famous one, in 62, where the supplier said, look, the Suez Canal is closed. The entire contract was based to supply quickly from here through the Suez onto Europe. And there's a Suez crisis, as you know. Court said, tough luck. Go around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. You can still reach England. The fact that it will take you more fuel, more time, more expense, sorry, that's not force majeure. By the way, that became a basis, one of the bases for the Energy Watchdog to reject frustration in 2017. These are all examples to show you how high the threshold is. And so on and so forth. I will not go into details, but mere onerousness in price has never been held with this great romanticized view of frustration as people tend to believe. Now, a quick look at, just by way of example, as I said, the factual context in which this was applied again shows how to you today in COVID, I would personally in fact believe that these should be excusing circumstances. But But the courts have not held it to be excusing circumstances, even in situations comparable to or worse than COVID. Take that famous case of Justice Mukherjee's judgment in Bangar. As an aside to your viewers, I hold Justice Mukherjee in the greatest stead. Outstanding judge who technically died one day after demitting office, but virtually in office. But he was the one about whom there's an anecdote that the Prime Minister conveyed that they wanted to appoint him as Chief Justice and not Meher Chand Mahajan. And Mukherjee is reputed to have written that he's my senior, I can't be appointed before him. To which Nehru again said that no, we insist, you've taken a collective decision. He wrote again saying that I'd rather resign. So he stuck to his guns and became after Meher Chand Mahajan, an outstanding judge. His judgment in Bangar, now Bangar was a case of requisition by the defense authorities in the context of the World War, of a project of real estate where the developer offered to the plaintiff the land and development of buildings, etc. Subsequent to that, there was requisition. It wasn't acquisition, requisition. It rendered large part of the project unworkable. Obviously, you could not build, you could not develop. The plaintiff sued. The defendant, I thought, made a very fair gesture. He said, you either take the money back, or if you insist, you take it on an as is, where is basis, which means take it as it is, it's your risk. The plaintiff insisted, said, no, you give me the developed thing, and you can't plead frustration. Remarkably, the court held that requisition is temporary. It doesn't defeat the identity of the bargain on which parties started. It will not be frustration. Even if the war's duration was uncertain, and perhaps the war's duration is as uncertain as COVID or vice versa, but both are uncertain. Even then, we all know that COVID will be temporary and so will war. So, it was defeated. This also gives an idea of how judges today may take a different view. But I mean, these are direct binding judgments of high authority. Alopi was the ghee case, where Alopi was a ghee supplier to the defense forces. So he merely supplied ghee, and then the World War broke out. And he wrote several times in between during the war that, look, it's become impossible to supply, it's very scarce, my expenses are more, please increase the price. The army kept quiet. He then claimed in his suit to also talk and said that they assured me that they will look into it. Anyway, the war ended. He claimed, the court said, tough luck. This is not sufficient to enhance your price. And they emphasized there, one of the points I made earlier, that price or onerousness is not a consideration for. The third one, Nehati, was in a sense a worse case because a supplier of jute, which was sourced from Pakistan. Nehati was in the aftermath of the 65 war with Pakistan. The case arose during the war, but it was decided obviously 2-3 years later. And so he said that, look, I am ready to supply, but there was that because it was sourced from Pakistan required a license. So the license was rejected. The court nevertheless rejected the plea of force majeure on two grounds. First, it said that the rejection was not a ban because it was a case-by-case rejection of license, which is understandable. He got rejected on the individual facts of his case, not that there was a ban on Pakistan-sourced jute. But the second part is interesting. They say that even if there is an embargo on Pakistan-sourced jute, it would not absolve altogether the parties from their obligations in the contract. Because you have to just find jute and supply it, although it was clear to everyone that Pakistan also sourced them. And these are tough cases. I mean, they are not cases I necessarily agree with. But this is a consistency between the independence onwards. And now you jump 3 decades and you continue to find the consistency in Energy Watchdog. Energy Watchdog, where I happen to appear for the losing party, who claimed that the basic and the entire bargain was based on supply. The party was a corporate, very big corporate house in India, which was an electricity supplier. They sourced their coal. It was a coal-based plant. And they said that everybody knows the entire basis is Indonesian coal. And they produced the law by which Indonesia trebled or quadrupled the cost of its coal. It was not even a regulatory statute. And they said this is impossible. And we proved, in fact, we virtually proved by showing that the supply of 1 unit of electricity will cost 10 rupees. And the tariff which I will get is 3 rupees. So I can't be expected to supply on a loss arbitrage of 5 rupees or 7 rupees. The court was very sympathetic. They looked at the law and they then held that there is no specific condition in the contract which says that this will be only on Indonesian law. The contract is for electricity. How you source coal is your problem, although we understand that parties proceeded on the basis of Indonesian coal. But the contract doesn't say that you will make electricity only out of Indonesian coal. So you jolly well source it from somewhere else. Second, they cited this Greek case I told you, that you have to find alternative sources of supply. And thirdly, they again repeated these principles that this is not a change in identity or fundamentals of the contract. It is largely a price or onerousness plea. And onerousness pleas don't impress us that much. This is 2017, a rather pessimistic response to your stakeholders who might be wanting to invoke. Now, of course, COVID will change even these cases, I'm sure. But this is where we stand. Now, let me quickly go on to an application and then come to the other topics. One area where it arises obviously is tenancy. That's the simpler one. And you know, tenancies of various kinds. There is that big tenancy of office, there is a medium tenancy of shops, and then there is a residential tenancy. But broadly, the tenancy field is clear that, look, I could not use it. And of course, it's in a way, it's sector neutral. It could apply to sectors from restaurants, to individuals, to shops, to offices. But again, even more pessimistic than the Indian threshold. Already you have the Indian law. And since the interruption of tenancy doesn't arise in residential cases where people are living anyway inside, but in other cases, would be temporary. So the temporariness has been a major ground for rejecting force majeure. And it doesn't create a new contract. It doesn't render it completely finished. But now comes the worst example beyond Indian law. The closest analog I found was a very interesting Chinese judgment, but Chinese only in form. It's a Hong Kong judgment applying English law. Very interesting. Directly like COVID, because it arose in 2003 in SARS. It was a SARS case. That's the closest you will get to force majeure and COVID. The very well considered judgment by a lower court judge, but very well written, relying on House of Lords and others. Basically, it says that, look, the landlord entered into an agreement with the tenant which included a lock-in. So when this SARS happened, obviously the tenant ran away because he found a couple of chaps in his building having SARS. And he came back after 2 months. And meanwhile, he told the landlord that, look, thank you, goodbye, Tata, I want to leave. You better keep the deposit which I have given you, but I can't maintain the lock-in. It is a small deposit. The landlord sued. He said, no, you jolly well keep my lock-in. I gave you a lock-in for 2 years. And he succeeded in this judgment, which emphasized the entirety of the law which I have said, including 500 years of English law, because Hong Kong still applies English law, although it's Chinese territory. And in that, there's a very interesting sentence which says, to the best of my knowledge, in 500 years of English tenancy law, nobody has had 500 years of English tenancy law, nobody has had a successful plea of force majeure. That judge did some research. And then he relied on 2 or 3 House of Lords judgments, which are very interesting, which I don't have the time to go into. So that's as far as the one particularized application on tenancy goes. Another application could be on issues which are related, for example, to contracts, supply contracts. Now, I am entirely in agreement that if you have a highway, for example, being made, and a highway requires a period, there is a milestone system, and there are penalties and termination, LDs, and what I call invocation of bank guarantees on milestones. So the period during which there is a lockdown would clearly by any court be held to be excluded. Because lockdown means you can't build a single inch on the highway. But only that period. So if you are behind by 10 years, you can't get COVID of 1 month or 2 months. But the more interesting and larger issue is that there are also compensation clauses which permit the highway contractor to claim against the highway owner. Would a COVID delay allow him to claim that? Because delays are a ground of claiming. Now that's a vexed question because both are innocent in many ways. I think the jury is out on that one. Personally, I believe that while such contracts would exclude the time for construction, where it is impossible to construct, I don't think the second part of those clauses, which all highway contracts have, compensation or reimbursement, will compensation, sorry, not reimbursement, will happen because it's a difficult call to make, and I don't think Indian courts will make that call in favor of the contractor. This is broadly my set of points about force majeure and frustration, both in the theoretical and the practical sense. But let me turn to what I think, in a sense, plagues the system and a very good alternative model offered to us by Singapore. Now, why I say this is that I spoke yesterday on an IBC, and like the judge, I gave 10 notifications where, on an ad hoc basis, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has done that, the RBI has done that, the central government has done that. In many cases, of course, Supreme Court has passed suo motu orders, NCLT has done. But what is this? This is patchy. This is disaggregated. This is non-uniform. It is episodic. It is knee-jerk because you react to a situation and one body takes out a notification, the other, and it's all very confusing. It is not, it increases multiplicity, it generates litigation, creates confusion, delay, lack of clarity. Look at what Singapore did, and this is very interesting. Singapore passed in March of this year, bang in the middle of COVID. And remember, COVID in Singapore was thought to have been conquered in the first few weeks. And then they realized that they're not as hunky-dory as they thought they were. So now they are again grappling, but in a very good situation. But they are now again in the middle of looking at various aspects. Now they passed a law in March, which they call the Temporary Measures COVID Act, etc., etc. A very interesting piece of legislation where I just want to highlight that all these vices of lack of clarity, patchiness, disaggregated, diffused, multiplicity, you have one comprehensive legislative code for COVID. I think we underestimate the importance of one single legislative code for COVID, and that's sorely needed in India. You have the, I found additional notifications to what the judges cited by the Ministry of Non-Renewable Sources, by some other ministry, taking care of that particular, gap in thought process. But here is a much better thought out overall scheme, which I think we should emulate. And the heart of this is part 2, section 4 of this act, Singapore Act I'm talking about, which I think bears some study in India. Starts with section 4, which says this applies to all contracts. So all contracts are taken care of, except to those who enter into a contract during this period of COVID, which is defined in the Act. Very nice thought that if you and I enter into a contract with the knowledge and the risk of COVID, then the contract will govern, not the Act. And they include it to apply to all government contracts also. So the government is not exempt from the Act. And very simple, lucidly put sections. Now 5 is the heart. It says, this shall apply, A, where a party to a scheduled contract has an obligation to be performed after so-and-so date. They give a date according to COVID. B, they are unable to do so and the inability is caused to a material extent by a COVID event. And C, that the party which is so materially affected gives a notification to the other party. 3 simple tests. Then comes the other part of section 5. That if this is there, what are excused? And this is, I think, the heart of it is section 5.3. It is about 2.5 pages, 2 pages. I cannot read it. About 22 examples, very precise, are given where force majeure and frustration will apply. Now it's your choice. You need not have everything. You may have some. It's a very incomplete and a unsatisfactory way of leaving it to judges case to case to create these categories. Now here, look at this list. I'll give you just 4 or 5. The comments, they are all suspended or will not affect one party prejudicially. The commencement or continuation of an action in a court against A or A's guarantor or surety. B, the commencement or continuation of arbitral proceedings, Justice Malhotra has talked about it. The commencement or continuation of arbitral proceedings. The enforcement of any security over any immovable property. Of course, Singapore has followed the model that if you want to protect against COVID, protect fully. They have no half measures. So even the beginning of a commencement of an arbitration is stopped. You can't go into it. The enforcement of any security over any movable property. The making of an application under Section 210 of the Singapore Companies Act for a creditors meeting. Of course, all suspension of limitations. Suspension of IBC, what they call insolvency and bankruptcy there in that country. And then so many more. I mean, I can't take you through all 2 pages. The appointment of a receiver or manager over any property, the commencement or levying of execution distress, and so on and so forth. And then, after this very comprehensive list, which remember, the virtues are of certainty, clarity, and specificity, and helps everyone, it goes on to then create in Section 10 onwards a very nice scheme of assessors, who are junior judges, who will assess the material impact and the causation from COVID. So you can't make a fake plea. This is a material impact, but it has to be a material, first it has to be effect adverse, then it has to be materially adverse, and then it has to be from COVID. Then you get these benefits. So the whole structure is created, and then it goes on from later sections to deal specifically, another very good aspect, unlike Indian law, it is very patchy, with construction contracts, one whole section, then with tourism related contracts, and so on and so forth. So this has to be a marriage of economists and lawyers to create a structure. Otherwise, it's all very patchy. You cannot do this without an economic perspective. The reality is the economics. Law is only a facilitative mechanism. And we are doing it in the abstract. A notification issued today and tomorrow, if your department finds something a problem, then you issue another one. And it's just kind of, it's like a shirt with 20 patchworks done on that. Well, having dealt with Singapore, let me come to wages, a third issue, which is pending in Supreme Court. And Justice Malhotra is not hearing it. And I'm only giving you a prima facie view. It's coming again after 2 or 3 weeks. The issue is interesting in that a large number of notifications, letters, documents were issued, almost 10 in number, at different times, 6 or 7 by central government authorities and 2 or 3 by state, saying, thou shalt pay wages. In simple terms, don't stop paying wages. Now, 99% of them, now I'm talking of law, I'm not talking of equity, mercy, grace, consent. In such situations, I would be the first to say that people should not stop paying wages. Be as humane as you can for as long as you can. But equally, it's a reality that while you can pay for March, you may not be able to pay for April. While you can pay for April and March, you may not be able to pay for June. So, now we're talking law. Now, 90% of these documents actually have no legal value because they are general letters. There is not even an application of mind towards the law. One, however, so it might have been possible for people to contend that there is no legal binding direction. It's just a wishful advice, a recommendation. Do please pay wages if you can. But on 29th March, they did issue what I think at least claims to be a delegated legislative notification under Section 10(1)(a) of the Disaster Act. Now, therefore, this part that there is no binding obligation because there is no law will not be right because it decides 10(1)(a). However, if you go to 10(1)(a), there is nothing, it seems remotely, present to the mind of the legislator regarding wages. It doesn't seem to connect with wages. So ultimately, this will await the wisdom of the Supreme Court. A, the challenge will have to be to the notification which there is, one batch. B, it has to be to the validity of Section 10 itself. A, because the notification is ultra vires, and B, because 10 does not purport to talk of wages, and C, because 10 may be violative of some part of the Constitution. So it has to be a tripartite 3-level challenge, which will then be looked at by the Supreme Court. As I leave this part of wages, I must add a practical point. The practical point is, my own view as a practitioner is that I doubt very much if any bench will easily, in the interim, at this stage, interpose itself to stay a direction to pay wages. It just seems to me that the optics of it and the reality of it is very difficult to conceive where this would meet with success at this stage. What happens after final hearing after 6 months, I don't know. Then the fourth aspect, which I think I was asked specifically, was about this point about workers when they're allowed to come back, infecting other co-workers, and the liabilities of workers or of the employer, more importantly. This is a very technical and a very narrow topic, so I don't think we'll just consider this because this could be discussed separately. But let me just give you a few bullets. It is an important area which is, I think, forgotten. And this is going to become more important in the next month onwards, or the later part of this month, when slowly people are limping back. And I think it really concerns the employer, not the employee who infects his co-employee. The employer will have to be very careful in terms of strictly going by the rule book on all lockdown and reopening conditions. That's point one. It literally has to look at them with a magnifying glass and observe them in letter and spirit. Two, if he is kosher on those conditions, namely that it is very clear that he is not violated, he still will have to have a whole proper paper trail with videography to show. Because there will be people who will try to take advantage and say that, look, he was negligent. And this law is loaded against the employer, unless he is very clear and very clear about keeping his paper trail and his videography about observing the conditions of road. There's a whole list of items you have to do to reopen. Sanitizer here, distance so much. There is even, I believe, I've not checked it up, but I believe a very interesting rule which says there must be an informal whistleblower inside your organization who will blow the whistle on you about not complying, and he has to be notified separately to the authorities, etc., etc. So, but what does it all show, this part? The real thing which it shows is, which was mentioned in passing by the judge, is the absence of our Public Health Act. Really, what we are missing here is a Public Health Act. And whether we can squeeze it within the concurrent list or whether we need some change there, but we need to have a comprehensive Public Health Act is what COVID teaches us. God forbid, not that there is COVID-2, but even if COVID itself flares up after 2 months, the Public Health Act will lead instead to patchy ordinances coming every day. Australia here, like Singapore in the other case, is an excellent example. They have a comprehensive National Health Security Act, very comprehensive. And they have even more comprehensive National Health Security Emergency Regulations. Even USA, which is much, much more federal than most countries, has a centralized Public Health and Service Act. As against all these comprehensive pieces of legislation, what do we have? We have 1897. We have 1897. Not even a square peg to fit a round hole, because it was not made for this situation. Completely radically different. Well, can I then end by two things very quickly? One, Mr. Nevatia rightly mentioned the economic backdrop. I'm not here to discuss economics. I'm here to discuss legal principles. But I think it's a very, very artificial approach if we ignore the economic backdrop. I'm pretty blunt about it, and I'm not talking at all anything to do with politics. I'm talking of economics. Monetary policy has its limits. A lot of good work is done by the RBI every day. They reduce the rate, what is called the repo rate, and they reduce the reverse repo rate. The reverse repo rate is the rate at which banks will put money with them. But do you know the reality of COVID? Banks have put the highest amounts of money with the RBI after the RBI has reduced the reverse repo rate. Why? Because banks don't want to take risks, but more important, banks don't have borrowers who want to take loans. Why is that? Because there is no liquidity in the system. And why is that? Because what we are sorely missing is a fiscal injection. When you're unwell, you start with a syrup, then you take a strong tablet. But when you're really in difficult times, you take a direct injection into your arm or into your thigh. Now, the injection is a fiscal injection which alone can combat something like COVID. Unfortunately, today, there's no point giving absolute figures. India has 0.7% of GDP as a fiscal injection, all told. So everything which you see and hear operates within 0.7% of GDP. Bangladesh, I'm deliberately saying Bangladesh, a country far weaker than us, has 2.5% on COVID of GDP given. You have, of course, in Malaysia, 16%, 1/6. Japan, 10%. And then, of course, many countries, USA 10%, Germany 20%, Spain 15%. So there is no substitute for fiscal injection. And then, of course, within that injection, you can have at least two targeted sub packages. One for migrant, one for MSMEs. Today, 40% of our exports, 45% of our other activity is all MSME based. 12.5 to 15 crore unemployment or employment trigger on this sector. You have to have it, otherwise all these seminars and legal principles are, incidentally, when just the judge mentioned, there's an interesting debate going on about two things which the judge mentioned. And I'll just take 30 seconds to mention that. The IBC, I believe, is very rightly expanded it from 1 lakh to 1 crore. It's very right. Because we don't have the infrastructure to deal with 1 lakh. 1 lakh's value today is nothing. And therefore, it's a trigger which is very low. But the object of helping MSMEs, there's a whole argument, not entirely wrong, out there saying that while MSMEs can't be sued easily, equally MSMEs themselves can't sue. Because MSMEs get their money from a lot of little bigger enterprises. And their right to go to IBC may itself be also affected. That's the flip side of this increase. But of course, on balance, I think it's a good move. And again, an example of our bureaucratic approach in India, the RBI notification which the judge mentioned, 27th of March, gave very little, of course, according to me, it deferred. It didn't give any interest waiver. So you actually end up paying even more money if you add the interest in many cases. But forget that. Well-intentioned move. But look at this funny part. 27th March, the RBI said you defer and roll over for 3 months, which means you get a 3-month benefit. 90% banks have applied it by counting March as the first of the 3 months. So the deferment runs from March, April, May. And it says from June you start paying. So they say at least you start asking us to pay from July. When the deferment is given on 27th March, this is the bureaucratic approach of banks. I don't think the RBI intended like that. It's a minor thing, but it's given an approach of how things can mean very different from what you intend them to be. Well, I think that is, there are other issues about court functioning and else which we don't have time for, maybe in questioning. But at the end of it, I want to only say this, that this is not merely a partial approach. It has to be very much more comprehensive, holistic approach, where law is a very important component of a facilitative kind. But it has to involve people discussing economic reality, law, and creating not reactions, but creating purposively a scheme which will last up to the next disaster, God forbid, ever it happens. Not of this kind, but any other kind. And that longer term code in law is missing because it is not being thought out with other stakeholders who are non-lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Singhvi. I think you took up all the points that I would subsequently have asked you. And yes, definitely now the call of the day is to define force majeure and perhaps bring a robust codification around it, because now there is no time to sit and interpret what is force majeure, what is not. And moreover, these cases were very old, and now it's in the era of globalization where we are all over. I think it is very important for us to have a single codification. But having said that, now we will want to know a little bit, so we can now take up some questions. We've got several, and my team has tried to shortlist a couple of them. Some of them are very fact specific. We will also take up a few of those, and some of them are generic. Now, to go to Justice Malhotra first, on her arbitration-related thoughts that she shared with us. So is Justice Malhotra there? Still, I
Yes.
can't. Okay, very well. And even in the post-COVID scenario, so it is being recommended to hold arbitration hearings, remote arbitration hearings. So how much ever such measures may not be possible if there is a detailed evidence to be led. So do you think the parties should be encouraged to do documents only arbitration wherever possible?
I don't think so, because there are some facts which would require oral evidence. I don't think one can dispense with it. One will have to improve the procedure of recording evidence rather than dispensing with it. Because, arbitrations which are based only on documents are like maritime disputes where you have a bill of lading and it's only the documents you need to look at. But in other big commercial disputes, evidence is certainly required. I think the procedure will have to be improved, technologically, and I think that should be the answer, rather than dispensing with it.
Right. And you mentioned institutional arbitration will play a greater role in facilitating the arbitration process post-COVID scenario. Should stress on that.
Certainly, I think institutions will be in a far better position to organize it rather than ad hoc arbitrations by a sole arbitrator who's doing it, at his own place or in a center. It won't be possible to, like, for instance, appointment of an emergency arbitrator before the constitution of the tribunal. It's far simpler for an institution to handle it rather than ad hoc judge.
Right. So my next question is to Dr. Singhvi. So here we have a question by some people who are in IT operations, and their question is that does invocation of force majeure clause by a lessee under a lease agreement, will it depend, the success of rather invocation of force majeure clause, will it depend on the nature of the type of business which the lessee operates from the lease premises? I think what they want to say is that, for example, will a lessee having a retail space in a commercial mall, they will find it easier to successfully invoke force majeure and not pay the applicable lease rent for that period during which they could not access the mall, in comparison with IT operation from an office space, because such a lessee who is in the IT sector may have been able to do work and achieve the same productivity level in a work from home mode. So what would be your answer?
Well, the pointed answer is, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear
yes.
me? The pointed answer is that, it's a sentence I forgot to mention, I should have. All of this depends and starts with the clause in the contract, number one. So above all is the contractual agreement.
Correct.
So suppose there is a clause which says that by any epidemic or any other reason the shop is unable to be used. I'm just giving you a hypothetical. Then yes, the party wanting to would be able to invoke. But A, if there is no such clause, or B, if there is a generalized clause which is not necessarily applicable to this situation, my frank and unpleasant answer would be frankly no. Because absent the clause, the law doesn't help as it stands today the party too much. And also, this part of the law is largely sector neutral, because it doesn't matter whether you are a shop or a mall or an office. It is temporary. You will get the use of it after 2 months. Till such time, the question before the court is how the act should fall between you and me. The court says the contract did not anticipate you are just supposed to pay rent. It's his premises. You keep paying rent. Now remember, the crucial dispositive aspect here is temporariness. So I don't think in the 2 or 3 months and the staggered way we are coming back to using the premises will, on the existing law, allow in the force majeure success. Yes, it's a different matter. We are talking law. Things are decided by courts, especially in the interim, on discretion, on mercy, on equity, on lots of things. And people can just bang their heads together and say, look, sit down and just divide the rent for 3 months into 1.5 foregone, 1.5 not foregone. But that's not a legal answer. I'm giving you that as it stands, absent a clause, if you are out of use for 2 to 3 months, it's not the landlord's fault, because the landlord's own premises is there and you should pay it.
Right.
If you're able to show permanence of a kind which changes your entire activity, that's a higher threshold, well, then yes, you may have some luck.
So, way forward for drafting and negotiating contracts, commercial contracts such as this. So, what would be your advice to ensure that this clause should be there properly?
Uh, lawyers can't be astrologers and clients can't be soothsayers, and thank God for that. So there will always be a new situation coming up in the future, which you can't anticipate. But certainly, a good start would be to make a clear clause now, and I'm sure that's going to happen from now on. You always learn the hard way, and you'll find these clauses sprouting. It's a fairly simple clause which addresses it directly, and with variations and modifications which lawyers know must cover a situation analogous or related to this. And it must be designed for next many decades, not now, which would mean wide words basically. For example, any A, law; B, delegated legislation; C, supervening event which renders it impossible to use.
Right.
These kind of words. I think it's fairly straightforward. Till such time as we come across another aspect where lawyers are required, which has not been anticipated.
Right. So, Justice Malhotra, we heard about from Dr. Singhvi and of course from you that the necessity of having a single code for the commercial aspects and also the necessity of having a single code for the health aspect. Now, what are your thoughts on it? That, for instance, this first major thing, which is now being left to the test of court, what if we would have, like how Singapore has? Is that a good idea? I know it is not such a good idea for lawyers, but now we have to be very, very magnanimous and think about the humanity as a whole. So is that a good idea?
Insofar as the public health aspect is concerned, it falls under entry 6, list 2, that is public health, sanitation, hospitals and clinics come under part 2 of the constitution in list 2. Now, so therefore, a national act on public health may not be possible, because that is why that bill was it was drafted. It was not even placed before Parliament because of this impediment. And the Disaster Management Act of 2005 is a centralized act which falls in the concurrent list under 2 specific entries. And I think that's wide enough to cover. And the ministries with respect to each, like it's the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Ministry of Finance, which has been issuing notifications which pertain to their ministries. And those can, be modified. There's a flexibility. We have an umbrella act. And we have a federal state system. Insofar as Singapore is concerned, it's a unitary state, it's a small state. It's far easier to do that. And Parliament is not in session. Under this umbrella act, I think each of the ministries can issue notifications. And if there is a problem, if the stakeholders feel that their interests are not protected with respect to private contracts between parties and force majeure conditions, they have to make representations for the issuance of notifications by their respective ministries. That's my thought for now, because we do have a central act, and I don't either Singapore or England have a national act at present. So they have come out with temporary acts with respect to the COVID issue.
Very right. Very right. Now we have one question from chartered accountants. A lot of them have asked this kind of question, which we've tried to merge it, and this is for Dr. Singhvi. We are all now hearing about the probable migration of industries from China, and we Indians want to capitalize this opportunity. Our competitors in this league would perhaps be countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, maybe some Eastern European countries. From the visible bottlenecks that the foreign companies face here, one important issue is on legal matters, which is that we do not provide speedy legal relief and there is no prior certainty on interpretation. For example, if we could have advanced ruling or pricing mechanism, we can have some advanced interpretations and certainty on tax and various laws, including labor laws. So what would your view be on this, Dr. Singhvi?
Well, firstly, it's a very large topic you are raising. So,
Yes,
I mean, this can take a whole seminar and more by itself.
I know, I know.
No doubt that there is a huge amount of lack of clarity and certainty. In a lighter vein, people say that India must now have, um, like, can you tick environment clearance, you know, air pollution clearance, water pollution clearance. You must also tick a box saying PIL clearance. Now, I mean, in an ideal situation, you'd be able to do it. Or it's an advance ruling. Now, we have made good beginnings in advance ruling. We have it in indirect and direct taxes. We have advance ruling authorities, but there are major exclusions even there. Major parts of advance rulings cannot be got even in those jurisdictions. So I think the sentiment is right, but a lot of it, the real problem is the what I call democracy tax. We pay a democracy price, and I think we should ultimately be proud to pay it, because if we didn't have our transparencies, our challenges, so we cannot control that part by legislation. The extent you can control by legislation, you must. You have to, judges have to become more uniform. Judges, PI, for example, is an unruly horse. It depends very much on the dexterity of the rider. Dexterous riders can manage PILs very well. You know where a PIL deserves to be looked into, doesn't deserve to be looked into. But you don't have uniformity. Judge A will do it one way, Judge B will do it one way, and we have a large system. So that's where things get clogged. So I think, to answer your question, we can ultimately, the only way to deal with it to 75% extent would be to create enclaves, which we used to call SEZs, where large parts of normal Indian laws will be suspended. It's as simple as that. If you want a special investment with a special degree, then you'll have to create a very strong structure to ring fence and fence ring it from the normal intrusions of a democracy. Now, that was the contemplation of our SEZs. But they died a bit of a premature death because of allegations and alleged scams and all that. But that is really if you make a very good legal structure, even going up to partially the constitutional level, and you decide very clearly that laws ABC will apply, laws XYZ will not apply. And courts will, in some areas, be completely and totally excluded and carry their ouster of jurisdiction of courts to a very high level. Then, yes, you are sending a index. Of course, the normal things are always there. Suspend labor law largely, suspend this law, that law. Those are anyway there. Then you are sending a message and an index of reassurance. And people will flood here. But you have to get your own act and structure together. You have to make those SEZs physically. Our SEZs last time, we made the legal structure first and we acquired the land after 3 years. So, you have to have synchronization. And then you need to have a much more comprehensive design. And courts also get that message that we will not interfere so much. That last 10-20% uncertainty we have to live with. We are a democracy. I think that's a small price to pay.
Right. So one question which on the infrastructure bit, because we know that because of this economic crisis, following the Keynesian economic theory, there will perhaps be a lot of stress on infrastructure, both urban and rural, and so most of it may have to be done through the PPP mode. Now, coming to that, these PPP contracts have again force majeure, change of law clauses, which are all subject to interpretation, various kinds. Now, but and also there is no overarching PPP Act, Framework Act per se in the country. So PPP contracts are largely governed by a whole host of laws. So is it a good idea to have a PPP Framework Act which will codify these concepts of force majeure even beyond COVID? Because we'll be relying a lot on infrastructure construction.
No, I don't think everything needs to be codified. That doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, what you need, I mean, the Singapore model, which I have not been able to fully show because it's obviously a long one, you can put all together for the areas which you want to address specifically. So, construction contracts, you can put a whole chapter there. Not that you will codify PPP. PPP codification can be a very, uncertain exercise and a difficult exercise. PPPs arise in different situations. But yes, the principles of construction contracts during COVID and pandemic times can and have partly been done in Singapore. Because they are specific. For example, the example I gave, that while the time will be excluded for completing a highway, whether the compensation can be claimed or not, that can be addressed straight away by legislation, either way. So that kind of a codification nitty-gritty, which is really nothing much more than uplifting your regulations into a statutory level, because there are some regulations here and there. But generally, I am not much in favor of having a PPP thing, because PPP will depend very much. You have to have flexibility in the joints to create a PPP mechanism in individual sectors.
Plus, there are sectoral laws on PPP as well, so it could be an exercise which may take some time also. So we'll take one or two questions. Do we have time? Do we have like 3-4 minutes time? The speakers?
Oh, yes, see,
Most of them, have been very broadly answered. And
5 o'clock or 5:05.
Yeah.
5 o'clock. So it's like 4 minutes from now. So most of them, the questions that we have, they are very pertinent, and they have been at a macro level been answered by the speakers, be it wages, be it force major contracts, be it government contracts, and wage cuts, MSMEs, all these have been answered. Now I have a very large questions, which is the last question, as I can see in the text box, which perhaps I'll read out. My question is to both the eminent panelists, that whether it is arbitration, mediation, conciliation, or any other modes of dispute resolution through online methods of dispute resolution, but where is the education to apply these procedures in the grassroots level of our legal fraternity? There are lakhs and lakhs of our friends from the legal fraternity who make their day-to-day living in lower and district courts. There is no infrastructure for them to access online ways of dispute resolutions. Online methods of dispute resolutions may sound good for the selected few of the legal fraternity, but not for all in the present structure. Even resolving matters through online to some extent is not transparent to some extent apart from the technical issues. I think this is a very emotional question. We should take it up. Dr. Singhvi, if we could have your quick views on this.
It's an important question. I understand his emotion, but I don't agree with him. I'll make my points in very few set of points, because it's otherwise a very large issue and really deserves a longer discussion. I wish we had come to it much earlier. One, I wrote a piece on this in the Indian Express about 3 weeks ago. That was Supreme Court focused. But I said that, there must be an attempt that when we come back to see, there is no two-way categorization of COVID and normal. There's actually a three-way: COVID, semi-normal, and normal. Because suppose you press a magical button on 19th, you don't expect hordes of lawyers to descend on the Supreme Court on 19th of May. The lockdown is over. They should not, and certainly I will not. So you have semi-normal, intermediate phase going on till August or whatever, and then you have the normal. Now for that, you need to work towards a system where technology, even after we are in the normal, 25 to 33% cases could be done like this to make it the normal across the country. Number one point. Number two, why are judges being made to grapple with such small things? 50 crores or less in the Supreme Court will do it to augment all the capacity. 35 judges can sit in 15 benches, according to me. And I have written in the article that 7 of those benches can deal with 10-year or more cases on virtual lawyering, the old cases. And the balance 5 can continue to deal with the current, and you must maintain the very strict filing norm, because otherwise kachra does get filed. To avoid the kachra filing, you must have the strict norm of filing. But you don't have the capacities. People are crying for internets. Why should that be? In 2020 of India, you talk of superpower. I think it requires and the Supreme Court is passing directions about COVID measure relief, this and that, and it cannot get for itself this amount of infrastructure, which should not be the job of the Supreme Court. It should be supplemented by technical, bright young people. Number 3, I think it is an overstated and an exaggerated viewpoint that lawyers are not computer literate for this thing. Everything requires a certain time. But today, you'll be surprised how people in the villages are literate on their mobiles and how much they can use. It's only that some amount of force is required for a few days to make them use it. And slowly, the object should be that after September, October, when we come back, even then 25 to 33% hearings should be by this method. And I see no reason why not. Number 4, I find judges today sitting together in the virtual hearings I do in the Supreme Court. I'm quite surprised. Why should they be subjecting themselves to non-social distancing? The reason I'm told is because they may not have a system to converse with each other. Now, that's a very silly thing according to me. Why can't there be a mute button where the judge can mute us all and talk amongst each other? And this is all technology. And judges are not supposed to do this. This is technology to be supplied by somebody. Number 5. Judges want to work. They say there's a problem about the papers, and if you touch the papers, you'll get infected. Not digitized. Point is that this is the divine and the comic. This is very, very small things which are holding us back. For the time you'll have to wear gloves, and there is no business why in the last 2 months people have not digitized a large volume of record. Just consider if out of 15 benches, 5-7 benches sat on this video conferencing, I'm talking of Supreme Court, and did the old 10 years and more and 5 years and more cases. It will easily dispose. And remember, always one side in India wants delay. So you have to have some element of compulsion. One side of the two parties wants delay. So you have to say that we're going to take it up, otherwise ex parte. Now coming to the bottom of the heap, there is a genuine problem, but not in big towns, not in rural India. There are people, even our district courts are very well equipped. So don't think. Yes, in some genuinely rural areas, there is a problem. That's where you have to take the next 6 months to make an effort. Otherwise, I can tell you that in district courts, whether it's lawyers or others, are making excuses in not wanting to do it. Otherwise, many people are happy to do it. In fact, I have done the hearing when once the Supreme Court system failed, we did it on WhatsApp. So, where there is a will, there is a way. You have to get your act together and push it. Unless you push things in India, it doesn't happen. And to a large extent, see what my friend is saying, the question is that you'll not have an ideal situation. But if you start in this way, you will reach 50%, 70%, 90%. And that's the way to go. I'm sorry I took longer than I expected.
Singh, these
No, that's
also, we are going through a transitional period. So it will take time to operationalize it in the high courts and the district courts, because virtual hearings actually have really not been able to make their way in the district courts at all, and not in many, many high courts. So technological advances and training of judges, training of staff, training of lawyers is going to take time. So I don't think it can be so swift. And there has been resistance even from lawyers, because a proposal was put to list a lot of matters, and there was no agreement on that. They said, lockdown, we don't want to come. So there has been a lot of resistance with respect to COVID, because people are extremely petrified of infection, whether it's the court staff, whether it's the litigants and the lawyers. They have not been willing to have too many matters listed. So we are going through a transitioning phase. And it will take time for the entire system to get operationalized. A first step has been made, but it will take further time for it to really become efficient.
Yes, I completely agree. So necessity is the mother of invention, and that is how it has been for centuries. And this could be the way to go forward, is to digitize our lives as much as possible. So I will now conclude the session. And I hope it was useful for all our participants to hear these esteemed speakers. And if you have more questions, I can see more questions coming up. But like I said, at a macro level, many of which have been answered. And micro level answering would really need a look into the facts, because each case is different from the other. It will be very harmful to give legal advice without knowing the facts. So on that, and of course, to conclude it, how I started it, and Mr. Nevatia also started it, is that law and economics will now have to go hand in hand, and we have to evolve situations which can be applied to resolve this entire thing, so that we can revive the economy, we can ourselves stay safe. And I'm sure the international community and all of us will be working very, very hard towards getting where we should be now. And so I must thank the speakers. I mean, I can't express I'm losing words on how much grateful I am feeling to both of them for having participated in this session. And thank you very, very much. I hope it was worth your time. And thanks so much. I'm really grateful. We all are.
Thank you.
Thank you.